34 years ago this month, I was ordained into the ministry of Word and Sacrament of the Presbyterian Church USA. And probably 69 years ago, give or take a few weeks, I was baptized at the baptismal font at St. John's Methodist Church in Aiken, South Carolina. I was a Methodist growing up. Two of the questions that I was asked at my ordination, and perhaps even were asked of my parents at my baptism, are, do you renounce evil in the world and its power in the world, which defies righteousness and love? And do you renounce the ways of sin that separate you from the love of God? And the answer is, of course, I renounce them. Meaning that they have no power over me anymore. That the powers of the world cannot overcome the powers of God. The powers of separation have been brought together by the love of Jesus Christ. I haven't seen it in a long time, but there used to be in newspapers, I don't get the newspaper anymore, but there used to be in newspapers a comic strip entitled Breakfast with Jesus. I don't know if you've seen that before or not. And in one particular strip, Pastor Joe, is sitting there at the coffee table with Jesus on the other side. They've got their coffee cups. Maybe it's coffee with Jesus instead of breakfast with Jesus. And Joe says, Jesus, I don't have answers for people right now. And Jesus says, you don't have to have answers for everyone, Joe. With all that's going on in our world, with the shootings and the storms and the floods and the border securities and the fights and the fundamental differences we seem to have in our country, not to mention all of the isms and the biases that have been a part of my life, not to mention all of my thoughts from time to time and a few of my prayers, honestly, from time to time, and conversations that I've had with friends around, with others. I still don't know what to say when people would say things like, what is going on? Or how do we get out of this? Or how can I help in this? Perhaps Jesus' answer to Joe was more right than I want to admit. You don't have to have all of the answers. So I find a little comfort and a little direction in the final words of Jesus to this lawyer who wants to bind him and catch him a little bit, who wants to corner him in how to answer, who is my neighbor? And when Jesus says, go and do likewise, I think he makes a good point. So, what does the Samaritan do? Three things I'd like to suggest to you. First, he sees the man in need. When he was invisible, that man seemed to be invisible to the priest and invisible to the Levite who passed him by. Actually, they did see him, but they promptly ignored him. We've done that. See somebody and just focus on something else and just go right on by. They saw him, but not as a neighbor, not as someone that they could have a connection with in some way. They saw him as a burden, or maybe even a threat. How often in our conversations with the other, those folks that aren't like us, whether they're refugees from injustice south of our southern borders, or in Gaza or Ukraine, or those who live across the tracks in Seneca here in our hometown, how often do we see them not as burdens and potential threats and avoid them, but as human beings and as neighbors to be engaged? That was the question, remember, of the lawyer to Jesus. Who is my neighbor? The Samaritan sees that man as a person in need. And for him, that's the only driver. That's the only thing that moves him forward. Here is somebody who is in need. Second, the Samaritan not only sees the man in need, but as a neighbor, but he comes over to help. He comes into this man's world, literally down into the ditch. He comes, as the biblical words would say, he draws near. He doesn't merely say, do you need some help? He gets in the ditch with the man. He crosses the street. He comes close. The priest and the Levite gave this fellow in the ditch, gave him wide berth, passing on far sides of him, creating even more distance between them and the man in the ditch than already existed. But the Samaritan instead goes to him and becomes vulnerable in that moment. Vulnerable, as in opening himself to see the other's pain, to see the other's need, to see the other's misery that they happen to be in. How often do we hesitate, perhaps even are frightened to come close to others because we simply don't want to bear their pain, or we don't want to be open to their need and perhaps have an answer to help, which means we will have to help in the kingdom of God. We don't want to hear the pleas of young mothers who are separated from their children when we keep at arm's length to those folk. We don't have to enter into their world. To see some, third, after seeing him and coming close to him, the Samaritan has compassion on him, tending to his wounds and transporting him to the inn and making sure that he is taken care of today as well as tomorrow and the day after that. I'll come back and I'll cover any costs that he has, the Samaritan told the innkeeper. To see someone is vital. To draw near is imperative. But the gesture that clinches the whole story is that the Samaritan actually does something about the situation. And it occurred to me that these three interrelated moves of seeing and drawing near and having compassion that leads to action offers us the perfect example of what it is to be Christ-like in our world today. And it mirrors what God did for us. God saw our vulnerability and our need, and then drew near in the incarnational birth of Jesus to embrace us. And then in the cross, took action by identifying with us to the very end, rising again from the dead so that death could not any longer dominate us. Now, it would be easy to stop right there and say, go and do likewise. And we go ahead with the worship service. That's why this passage is a favorite, I think, of morality preachers. Do this, this, and this. God bless you. Go out into the world. Amen. But there's one more thing I noticed this week that strikes me about this text. That it was a Samaritan who stopped to help. It was a Samaritan, Jesus said, as if he wanted to make a point, a morality point with the lawyer. If I wanted to make that point with the lawyer, I would have used another Jewish lawyer as the guy who stops. Be like him. But he used a Samaritan. A Samaritan. A person who was lower than the lowest rung on the Jewish social ladder. A bit of history is needed. In 722 BC, the Assyrian army, kind of north of Syria, present-day Syria, had that whole kingdom. That army swept down on the northern part, the Galilee part of modern-day Israel, the country of Israel, and invaded that place and took 10 out of the 12 tribes captive and deported them all. All the people were suddenly uprooted and gone. And the ones who weren't captured fled and got out of there quickly. And some who were the residents of Samaria, which is the region between Galilee in the north and Judah in the south, right in between there, those folks stayed right there. And the invading armies let them stay, probably because they were too close to Judah, and Judah had a formidable army at the time. And those folks in Samaria intermarried with the Assyrians and with others that the Assyrians brought in and set up their own temple at a mountain called Gerizim and proclaimed that temple to be the true temple of God, as opposed to the temple in Jerusalem, where the Judah folks felt that that was the real location of God. They hated and were hated by those in the south of Israel. They existed in Jesus' time, and oddly enough, there were about 500, give or take, Samaritans still alive today in the region. Imagine, in Jesus' story, a Jewish lawyer hears that it is a Samaritan, the one person that they hate, who stops to give aid. We don't know the person in the ditch. We don't know where they were from, what their nationality was. We don't know anything about the person in the ditch, which was brilliant on Jesus' part, because really, it doesn't matter, does it, who's in the ditch? But the Samaritan reached out his hand, who was the person in the ditch. I guess we do know he was male in the story, but he could have been female. She could have been female. Could have been white or black or Jewish or Syrian or Egyptian or gay or straight or Hispanic or Puerto Rican or Irish or Protestant or Catholic or non-believer or anyone. Who knows who that person was in the ditch? But what they did know, what we do know, was they knew what it was like to be put down and tossed aside. Don't you think that the Samaritan knew what it was like to feel hate and to be tossed aside and to be ignored? When you met somebody on the street, the Samaritan would hopefully hope that they wouldn't cross over, but they did and crossed over and passed by. Don't you know that the Samaritan knew what it was like to watch as people would ignore his folk, his people? Don't you think she wondered what the rest were thinking when she took her place at the table in a restaurant or at a boardroom meeting? Don't you think he felt the nervous eyes of people looking at him when they came into Mayberry's, maybe? In spite of all those questions, the Samaritan stopped, noticed, stopped, reached out a hand, and helped. He helped, and he offered love. God shows up in the most unexpected places and in the most unexpected people. And sometimes, most times maybe, we miss it. We miss it when we fail to see and draw near and help those who are in need. Not just the needy, but those who are in need, deep inside, those who have fallen off the grid, those who are struggling in life because of the injustices that have been placed on them, or the years-long biases that they have been carrying. When we fail to see and draw near and help those that we ignore, we miss risking the saving presence of God in our life and in the world. We live in a broken and sinful world. That's a line out of our confession, one of our confessions in our book of confessions in the Presbyterian Church. We live in a broken and sinful world where evil does have power and we are separated from God by our sin. But thanks be to God for that hand of love that reaches even into my biased life, my singular issued life, my insulated life, and pulls me up out of the ditch with love. And it doesn't matter who I am, or what shade my skin is, or what gender I am, or where my ancestors called home, or how I worship. It doesn't matter. 10 years ago, the show Hamilton opened on Broadway in New York City. And the author and composer Lin-Manuel Miranda won his Tony Award for the production of that show. And in his acceptance speech, he said in part this: "When senseless acts of tragedy remind us that nothing here is promised, not one day, this show, Hamilton, is proof that history remembers we lived through times when hate and fear seemed stronger, and we rise and fall and light from the dying embers. Remembrances that hope and love last longer, and love is love is love is love is love, and it cannot be killed or swept aside." You might remember the song, "What the World Needs Now is Love, Sweet Love." I want to hear that on the radio. And that love reaches down through us to the victims in the ditch, to the shooters, to the CEOs, to the food stamp recipients, to those in multi-million-dollar homes and the undocumented who cleaned them, into the jail cells and the internment camps, to those in the halls and the rooms of this community, to lift us all up and to give us a meaningful and sacred life, to remind us that when hate seems stronger or hatred should be stronger, you ought to not like that person like it was presumed that the Samaritan had, that love cannot be killed or swept aside. The priest and the Levite, you and me, we all do the obligatory act. We have the meetings. We do something good because we feel like we have to. We choose to participate in one act of kindness over another. We drop a few coins into the plate when it's passed, and it feels good. Like the Levite and the priest, why should we risk losing our lives for someone in the ditch? Simply because it's the only way to find life. It's another bit of history. In this particular text that Luke is writing, Jesus has been in Galilee most of his 3 years that he's living in his ministry, but now he's on his way south to Jerusalem, and he knows why he's going. He knows there will be a hated mob. He knows that there will be a trial, and he knows that there will be a death on the cross. That whole act shows me how far God will go to demonstrate God's love for each of us. And then Jesus has the boldness to say, hanging on a cross, to forgive those who put him there. No one is beyond God's love. And it's the most unlikely character, a Samaritan, who serves up God's mercy and God's grace. It was true 2,000 years ago. It's still true today. For those, if you were in the ditch, for those who have ears to hear this morning, hear.